Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Welcome Change, the wonderful format where um, Ashoka organizes a conversation around what it takes to create real change in the world. And I'm Sasha Haselmeyer. I'm today's conversationalist. I'm an Ashoka fellow and author, and I work for Ashoka, which is like the triple privilege here. And I'm very, very excited to welcome Tessy Britton to today's conversation. Welcome, Tessy.
Hi, Sasha.
I'm a big, big, big fan of Tessy because I am obsessed with all questions around cities and participation. And here we have Tessy Britton, who is a social designer and Ashoka Fellow based in Edinburgh. She's the founder of Participatory City, an organization dedicated to developing new neighborhood systems that improve everyday lives. And since 2010, Tessy has been learning from citizen innovators around the world who are inventing new, more inclusive models of local collaboration through practical participatory projects. Participatory City has aimed to discover what the essential ingredients are to support these activities at scale and in the long term. And her approach is really focused on designing new types of what she calls bridging social infrastructures. We'll talk about that in a moment, that enable closer friendships among neighbors, greater collective agency, to do things together, and the kind of public tools we need to co-create and act on challenges we face. And she's highlighted this over and over in our conversation we face as a multicultural society. So, Tessy, I am so glad to have this conversation with you. And I want to start with a question that is a lot on our mind these days at Ashoka. Um, we're pursuing this mission of creating an everyone a change maker world, and at the core of this is what we call meaningful or true participation. And I want to ask you, what in your mind is real participation, and why is it so important?
Thanks, Sasha. That's a great question. I think you mentioned that it was also part of the theme for your global summit later this year. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. In September, we'll have a whole summit under that theme.
So I guess I think there are a lot of ways to participate in society, and we've been focusing on understanding practical peer-to-peer co-creation as an emerging model and developing the infrastructure to grow this type of participation in single geographies and neighborhoods. But while I think this model is really crucial, there are so many other ways that people participate, and I don't think that this new model invalidates the other models at all. So I think that the types of participation that are very, very common in our society, such as being involved in local democracy through representation or charity or challenge, even consumer and associational types of participation, I think that they're all really important, and I think that they sort of pull on all these different kind of emotional draws that we have, such as responsibility or empathy, even anger. So I think that this feels, the stuff that we've been doing, it feels like a missing piece of that, and I think that it fits very well with the everyone change maker idea as well, which I absolutely love. Because it also means that we're not just supporting people with big ideas, we're actually enabling people to co-create the places they live on their terms in the way that they can, given their situations, their demands in their life, etc. So I think that it all fits very well with that. So while I wouldn't say what we're working on is true participation, I think it's a missing component in lots of neighborhoods.
Yeah, and you mentioned in our prep call that social cohesion is this major global crisis. The World Bank, you mentioned, ranks it as one of the four biggest risks that the world faces. And I think a lot of the practices that you've developed with participatory city is to strengthen social cohesion in itself. And often when we talk about participation, we narrow it down to participation in democracy or political procedures or in urban projects or building design. I think what you're doing here is the value of participation on our relationships, of collaborating, is really central to your work. And I think one of the ideas behind your work is what you call the creation of these third spaces, or this those bridging social infrastructures. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and how that works?
Sure. I think the structure of many of our neighborhoods makes meeting and getting to know people different from us quite challenging. And it's increasing in the UK and elsewhere. Some of those traditional opportunities we used to have in libraries, in some places they're fine, in other places they're closing. And I think even remote working has made it even more difficult to build connections between people outside of one's immediate circle. So I think that our approach to these third spaces, as you describe them, it's vital physical infrastructure, but the space and the practical equipment are only one element of our approach. They work to support and enable the co-creation of this future vision of the neighborhood, and that requires a lot of things working together, you know, a trained co-creation team, lots of, you know, implementation of a very exacting sort of strategy to bring residents in, and to find a perfect participation point for every person that we talk to. So I think that the third spaces is one component, but it also needs to work with many other things need to be in place for it to sort of really, you know, come to life, so to speak.
Yeah, you know, it resonates really strongly with me because we talk about creating a world where everyone feels invited and capable to contribute. And the everyone, of course, is the really big challenge, because a lot of the things we have in our neighborhoods, in our lives, are designed for the majority, or for those who need to be there, who are seen as being enough. And then on the edges, things get difficult, right? How do you insert yourself into the life of a very busy single mother with two children and care obligations when you want them to participate in the neighborhood? You created something called the Everyone Everyday ecosystem. And I thought, when I read up on this, what was so special about it is that people who experience this in your research and in your impact studies say they feel included and accepted. They feel confident and capable. What better way of saying they're ready to become what we would call change makers? So I wonder, can you share a story or a kind of scenario of what that journey looks like from someone who may not be part of the neighborhood, who may not be participating, and how through the work of the infrastructures and environments you create, they're finding their way to express themselves, I guess, through participation?
That's a lovely question. I mean, I have so many examples come to mind, but I'll give you two sort of different examples. So I've obviously changed the names, but Mandy was one example, and despite being unemployed, she was caring for her mother and she was facing mental health challenges herself. With all that in mind, she also offered to host a session on financial budgeting. So she was drawing on her experience as an accountant. And Barry was another example where he was recovering from alcohol-related difficulties, and he readily offered to start woodworking project, showcasing and sharing his skills. And these examples aren't exceptions. They really have represented the norm in the work that we've done. So engaging in these activities helps people to focus on new skills, connect with others in a friendly atmosphere, But they also describe this, describe the effect of this type of activity as building a sense of optimism and renewal and making it easy for them to tackle their other challenges. So if you experience difficulties in your life, it's quite rare, or people have described it as quite rare, to meet people that focus on your talents and ideas instead of your needs and problems. And people have really described that approach as being quite transformative. So taking care to treat everyone with equal respect, bringing the focus to what we all care about, what we have in common, regardless of your background or your identity, helps people to feel welcome and accepted and included. And this was the sort of the journey that people described to us over and over again, that this was like the beginning of that journey towards becoming more active, more creative, more confident, more optimistic. So I think that sort of that cycle that people really described to us was very common amongst the many people that we gave sort of in-depth interviews to. But I think if we're looking at sort of how do we build this new vision of a neighborhood, we have to make inclusion absolutely central to that and build out from there. I can't see the point of starting any other way, you know. And while I've sort of said how much I respected all these other ways of participating, I think many of them aren't actually including everyone at the moment. So I think inclusivity is really important.
Yeah, I think I want to talk about that in a moment. I just wanted to come back to something you told me in our prep conversation. You said at the end you found what works looks very old school sometimes. And could you explain that? Could you elaborate on that? Because basically participatory city was a big R&D project at scale, which is already very unusual for our field. And then I think that you're finding that what good looks like in many ways looks a bit old school. I thought was such an interesting insight and observation.
I think really there were sort of two factors with that. One is that I think that when residents are invited to participate in a way that suits them best, you know, which really draws on their ideas and their talents, but also fits with these demands of their lives. And those participations can be big or small. I think when it's practical, everyday participation, you know, cooking, growing, making, sharing, repairing, all of these kind of practical activities, it's quite easy for people who are used to seeing residents in maybe more political terms or sometimes in more sort of instrumental terms. It's very easy to undermine these activities and to sort of almost to trivialize them. So I think that really winds me up no end. Because I think that I think that what they're doing is actually the residents that have participated, they're actually changing fundamentally what it feels like to live in that area, because they're fostering friendship, they're fostering trust, and these are things that government can't do, services can't do that. And they're changing what it's like to grow up there. They're changing what it's like to grow old there. So, you know, they are literally co-creating through developing these networks of friendship and trust. So, you know, I can't emphasize enough how important I think that is. And the activity is almost just an excuse, really. You know, it's an excuse. It has secondary benefits. It may be very planet positive. It may be nurturing learning, all of those, you know, health, all of those different outcomes. But primarily, or its starting point, is about building those networks of relationships, and I do think that is hugely important, particularly as you said earlier, in the fact that we live in multicultural neighborhoods now, and we don't have enough opportunity to meet and understand each other.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is really important about your work is that none of this is simple. And I've worked with a lot of local governments myself, and typically when we think participation, we think about participation in politics or participation through what local governments organize, and they typically organize participation by project, right? We need to go through public participation or consultation procedures to see whether this neighborhood project is going to be valuable, or whether this people have enough acceptance of this idea that we have. And you're building this different infrastructure because, and I think this is important to point this out, these transactional modes of participation, they are framed in a way that you're looking for the answer to a specific question in a specific time frame. And both those things tend to exclude the everyone, right? It is impossible for people to think that that is the most important question right now in their lives, and that they're the experts to answer that question. And it also is very difficult to make the time available. And I think the other extreme is community organizing, where you're saying, let's build an agenda out of the community on what we want. And you're describing a new type of middle ground, I think, which is really saying the practice of participation cultivates social cohesion, cultivates all these positive outcomes in and of themselves. And I kind of want to ask you, from social entrepreneur to social entrepreneur, what does it take to operate this, and who needs to step up to make this kind of thing happen? Because we don't really have the resources around to organize this, because people either think project or they think campaign, but we don't really seem to be thinking, how do we build this as a social, you call it social bridging infrastructure, right? What does it take to do this?
I think that over the last couple of years, I've sort of, I think that as a social entrepreneur, as you say, building a social R&D project, which is quite unusual to do. We were pretty open-minded, but we were also, I guess, subject to a lot of external pressures around trying to make this approach be the answer to everything. So everybody would be looking for prevention, cost savings to the public purse, lots and lots of things people were kind of looking for, but I think really looking at it from both the implementation, which you touched on, but also the sort of the investment logic. I think it has a different investment logic than I previously thought, and I think it has to be invested in. This isn't something that you can have. I see the value of social cohesion in small pockets, but actually it's a national, it's a countrywide, it's a worldwide problem. And I don't think that anything we've seen indicates that it's going to happen naturally. With more and more people moving into multicultural neighborhoods, it's clear, and it's a human. Anyone who's studied human nature knows that we find comfort and safety with people like ourselves, and so we see across Europe loads and loads of places where people are living in parallel communities. So they're side by side, but they don't know each other. And so I think that we have to be realistic about the investment that it takes. But in terms of how simple it is to organize, I think that you're essentially building a new system that involves a well-trained team, a very clear co-creation strategy. All the necessary elements need to be in place. It requires a lot of coordination. So depending on the size of the neighborhood you're working in, it could be thousands of people that you're talking to every day, every week, every month, drawing together hundreds of sessions and activities. So it's almost like a bit of organizational machinery which makes this possible. But we're into the next phase of codifying the approach, and I'm pretty confident that the sort of online learning course we're creating will make it much easier and much more straightforward to implement. But the learning needs to sit side by side with some serious investment and long-term investment, not 3 years, not 5 years, more like 20 years. It needs to become part of, it needs to be as commonplace as roads and park benches and libraries and all of those things that we think are important. So I hope does that answer your question? It's not,
no,
it's not simple, and it
no,
needs investment.
and I think one really important part I think you're pointing out, and I think that many people trying to contribute or organize real change face, is that all too often people are saying, what are the cost savings of this? And I think in my work, also working with city governments, that never turned out to be the thing that actually leads to real change, right? It's almost like it's a short-term expectation. People want to feel that you're not just making the world better, but somehow you're also saving money, which is already unlogical. But also in the end, what I found, what motivates people to change their behaviors and invest in these kind of new structures, is actually the empathy with the change on the ground, seeing these relationships flourish, seeing the impact of their effort, is a much bigger draw to change things than this idea of obsessing about cost savings models. You could prove that you could save billions of dollars and pounds with this, and it would actually not accelerate change. And I think this is kind of like a dead end that so many of us run into, especially when we're developing new ideas and we're getting the first prototypes out into the world. So I actually have this question here from my colleague Manmeet, who's asking, what do you think was most persuasive in convincing city governments to invest in this and participate this in the long term? And maybe you can talk a little bit more overall, who actually was needed to make your work happen? Was it all city governments, or were there other partners who helped you make this possible?
We had a group of funders. Some of them were independent funders. Some of them were the National Lottery in the UK. We had some funding from the local council and city government. So there was a full mixture of funders. I think though that was helpful for a social R&D phase of the work, but I think I'm curious to see what will happen in the next stages, where I do feel that we've definitely evidenced and we've refined an approach that could solve a very long-term, very expensive problem around social cohesion. And I'm curious to see where the funding might come from in a different scenario. I think that there may be different mixtures of it. And I think that I certainly saw that having a group of funders was really helpful in many ways. I think it can also be complicated because, although you think in the beginning that everybody is understanding it in the same way, over time, I actually began to understand that they were all looking for different things. And so, yeah, it does make it more complicated. And I think I would now avoid, if I can, I'm not sure if it's possible to avoid it. I would, if I could, sort of local government funding, which is insecure in that it is politically insecure. Do you know what I mean? It can be changed. And I think that we need a much more solid, much more long-term base for this kind of funding. I think one of the problems around the funding is that if you think about social cohesion is what you're trying to create, the opposite of that is actually strife and violence. And actually the cost of that is estimated globally, even just on interpersonal and self-inflicted violence. It's estimated at 2.25 trillion in 2009, which is eye-watering. But all of those costs are being carried by tons and tons of different players, organizations, countries, all that sort of thing. So it's definitely one of those problems where it's having a huge economic impact, lack of cohesion, but it's hard to attribute the cost to a particular player who that then might be invested in it. So it's a complex thing, and I think a lot of the things that Ashoka Fellows are developing actually fall into that kind of situation.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've seen that before, Sasha.
Yeah, no, I think it's also a lot of the time when we prevent problems from happening, it's much harder to mobilize the resources to prevent a problem, even if that's a lot more cost effective than to treat the symptom of when it's occurred. And I think right now we're seeing that maybe the world also for a very long time has focused on technical solutions or cost saving models and overlooked the risk of social cohesion falling to pieces, and the room that creates for political polarization, for deepening in many ways our divisions. I have another question here talking about complexity from Timothy Staub. He writes that it seems to me that we need a new social model that accentuates connectivity, collaboration, experimentation, learning, positive and negative feedback loops. And he wonders whether you've studied and considered complexity theory and complex adaptive systems. Yeah, so maybe you can just talk a little bit about complexity in your work and thinking about complex systems.
Yes, definitely. And I think what's interesting is you're emphasizing complex adaptive systems. And one of the things that one of the dynamics we've come across is that we're very used to using the language of sort of replication in our in our world, and scaling and things like that, which I actually think are really important. But I think it's the way this has been designed, the sort of co-creation strategy is intrinsically adaptive because it's built with everything that is local. So although it's a strategy and a way of doing things, it is adaptive, and it is designed to develop complex systems which shift and change. So, for example, you're not looking at creating short-term projects which are isolated, which are then, have 12 months or 2 years and then they disappear. You're having a network of activity which is sort of like a living, breathing ecosystem, and I think that is quite a complex and adaptive system. But if you're the person that raised the question wants to send me an email, I'd love to talk more about that.
Wonderful. And I think I'm reading Martino Cortes's question here about the role of technology to ease participation in a community, and whether the impact in terms of social cohesion is still pursuable without meeting in person, but reaching greater portions of the community by using technology as an enabler. And I kind of want to throw in here your anecdote, if it was an anecdote in our conversation when we prepared this session. You said that the spark for this model that you're talking about was you seeing a self-organized, I think, community meeting or participation that worked much better than all the other things you've seen, and seemed to take much less effort than the things that you see. So I would love to hear maybe that kind of dynamic that you saw happening there, and that underlies, so to speak, the magic of your work, but also then this question of technology as an enabler to make things more accessible for everyone.
Yeah. Yes, I think just to refer to your comments about this emerging model, and this is very much citizens in communities around the globe were starting new kinds of more practical projects. People were much more on an equal footing, something which is so important when you connect that to contact theory. So contact theory, reducing prejudice through contact with people, works best when people are on an equal footing with one another. So what we've been doing really is building on that emerging model and finding out what it takes, what infrastructure is required to sort of stimulate and grow, and also understand what the impacts are of that. I certainly think that my thoughts on digital have changed over the sort of the course of the 6 years or so when we've been doing this at scale. I think that we're kind of digitally supported. So we used a lot of digital platforms for organizing, for communicating, and so on. But I had thought that it would be more effective, that kind of online networks side of things. And we did a lot of that. We you know, when COVID hit, we immediately jumped everything online. But, you know, residents didn't find it nearly as compelling. And the minute COVID was over, they wanted to be back in person. And so the online stuff pretty much died away. So I think that it is much more powerful to build relationships with people face to face. It feels much more normal, I think. And I think the digital takes a more supporting role rather than a fundamental role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think again, one of the extraordinary things about participatory city has been that you were able to explore these different avenues, but not be limited by them. You could explore the role of technology without saying, well, everything now has to be done digitally because that's what we set out to do. But you could test them, compare them side by side, and always have very nuanced insights. We have a question here from Carlos Delgado, who's asking about whether this way of building cities and communities can be adapted to needs or localized in Latin America, where political instability and trust in government are, and he wrote at high levels. I think he meant where the levels are low. And I want to kind of just package this in a small anecdote. In October, I presented my book at a conference, and mayor from Mexico was there who was saying, well, our election terms, we're only allowed to run for office once in local government, and the election cycles are very short. And so the challenge we have with community participation is that there is discontinuity in the longer term planning. And he was kind of dividing up the world, saying the expert planning is done by administrators and bureaucrats and engineers in government, and the community was doing the little stuff. And he was worried about the continuity. And I think what you said earlier, the low level of expectation of what citizens can do. And I think the science around participation tells us exactly the opposite. Our expectations cannot be high enough for what people can contribute. And I was saying to the mayor, well, maybe you're looking at it the wrong way. Maybe the strategic long-term planning should be what the citizens do, and what the government does in these fast-changing political cycles is to look after short-term implementation of services. And I just want to, because I think it resonates with this question of perception of instability, because citizens are very stable in a way. And kind of in a way our politics move, all these kind of things happen at fast or low pace. We may have more or less trust, but actually often our expectation is that we give the menial small decisions to citizens, do the small little bits of co-creation, and not so much entrusting them with the bigger responsibilities. And I think it resonated just with what you said at the opening. So I don't know if you can answer the question about these implementing this model.
Pasha. It was so long ago, you know. Yeah, it's an interesting it's an interesting topic. I mean, in both the councils that I've worked closely with over the last sort of 14 years, I think both of them have been subject to this political change. And even when you have a very innovative leadership team, they tend to move on at some point, and then things go, things swing the other way, and that's happened in both places that I've worked with. So I think finding a way of building this work, this infrastructure, financing it from a more independent viewpoint, but kind of incentivizing councils to be partners, I think could be the way forward. But I think one of my friends called Alex Ryan, he alerted me to this Regeneration Foundation, and they are investing in restoring environments, but they are doing it on sort of minimum of 100,000 hectares. And very often those transcend national boundaries as well. They cross over national boundaries. But for each of these projects, they're investing $1 billion for 20 years. And I think that the cohesion issue is as important as that, and should be looked at the scale of that. So I think disentangling it in our minds, I think, from the usual ways that we do work with city governments, and building new players that can actually have a much more long-term view, is probably the best way of going forward.
Yeah, I love these conversations about scale, and I want to throw some numbers into this conversation. One number is that I think you told me that you calculated that in a city like London, building participatory city like bridging social infrastructure would cost about 0.5% of local government spending. To put that into context, local government spending is typically, generously, if we say at local government level, about 10% of GDP. So we're talking about 0.05% of GDP to build the infrastructure anywhere that can sustain social cohesion and enable us to respect and trust one another. I think that's a very, very low investment, and anyone who's following spending on defense, on policing, on wars and mental health issues knows that this is really not a big budget. I think the other number that comes to my mind is that you're talking about long-term infrastructures. And as you know, I'm a big fan of propagating the idea that real change takes a long time. And I'm very grateful that you're resisting the temptation of describing your work within the confines of the traditional funding cycle and more into what this really needs. And this needs to transcend the sort of 3-month public participation cycles that governments offer. It needs to transcend the 3-year funding cycles of even the most enlightened philanthropists. And it needs to be a thing that becomes almost a timeless infrastructure that we're creating to prevent really serious harm. And I think that will also then enable, like you said, so many other planetary and human benefits. And so this idea of permanence, of designing permanence into this and thinking about funding and sustaining this work from a place of permanence rather than like, how do we get from one day to the next and just keep the ball rolling? And I appreciate that right now you're reflecting on these questions. After the experiment, what next and how can you institutionalize it? So maybe if you just want to share with us in a minute or so, what do you think, what is your vision for what could happen over the next 10 or 20 years, or what do you think needs to happen? How do we need to think about this problem so that we're not getting trapped in the little things and that we're addressing it at the right scale?
Goodness, big questions, 1 minute. Thanks, Sasha.
Take your time. We have time. We have time.
I thought we were overrunning already. Are we not overrunning?
A little bit, maybe.
A little bit. I think that what I would love to do. How about that? I'll frame it like that. What I would love to do is raise a very serious endowment, and probably, different national endowments, which could provide that long-term financial stability that would encourage cities to really go for it. And I think most places that I know, city governments I know, find decision making on these kinds of initiatives much easier if there is inward investment. So I'd love to raise something sizable, which could mean that many more people could say yes, and actually commit to it. Because there are, I don't speak to a single person that doesn't think that this is needed. Do you know what I mean? And I do try and speak to people outside of our our usual bubble. And so many people think it's the right thing to do. And maybe it's my job to find a way of doing that.
So what a beautiful.
You've promised me your unwavering support in this. Do you remember?
Oh, I was going to say, what a beautiful call to action to end on. And I think for everyone here who is interested in seeing this work flourish and building this kind of infrastructure, I think this is the moment. And Tessy, I'll be the first person to be there. Also, every one of you, come and join us on the topic of participation for our Changemaker Summit in Hamburg. And Tessy, hopefully you will be there so that we can maybe continue this call to action and this conversation. I want to thank everyone who's participated here for the thoughtful questions. Yes, Toby, a recorded version will be available. And thank you all for joining. And Tessy, thank you for sharing these invaluable insights.
This is my favorite subject, and thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Mine too. And so I will now be the responsible person in the room and say, we'll wrap this up. Thank you, everyone. And take good care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.